Hello everyone, welcome to the Geophiles. That noise in the background is the air conditioner. It's about 90 degrees Fahrenheit out, which is about 32 degrees Celsius. I apologize for it in advance. We're going to talk about some of the stuff you see behind me, but this is going to be a little different, a little special episode, if you will. Usually when I do this, I talk in length about some geologic topic, and I do it in a technical manner. This season I varied from that a little bit, as you know, with the Jugurtha Tableland episode and the Plate Tectonics episode. All of this stuff will be included in the description if you want to watch those videos as well. But today I'm going to talk about Devil's Tower, Wyoming, and I've done videos about that in the past. But something's been happening lately, and before I can get into Devil's Tower in detail, I'm going to have to explain some of this stuff because it is relevant. Alright, so let's talk about what is evidence. Now I'm going to talk about what is evidence from a scientific method standpoint. I've done whole videos on the scientific method. You can watch them if you want. I'm not going to go into great detail or depth into that subject. So the stuff you see behind me, we'll get into that here in a minute. But what is evidence? Well, in science or in reality, if you actually want to understand reality and produce a model that is reflective of it, you have to use what's called empirical evidence. And that's basically just evidence gathered by observation, testing, experimentation, stuff like that. Okay, it's not stuff like claims. All right, claims aren't evidence of anything. All right, they're just a claim. It's a statement. Even a hypothesis isn't evidence. It's an explanation of something. Okay, now claims, unlike hypotheses, are not based necessarily on empirical evidence. A claim can be something out my backside, like unicorns make the sky blue, something like that. It has no inherent truth to it. Now, you're going to hear me use words like truth and proof. In science, truth and proof have no meaning. Proof is for maths. Truth is not something science seeks in the absolute sense. But I am going to use them in lay terms so I can keep the conversation going, okay? I might say truth when I mean fact. Just like a fact is just a tidbit of information, but we also use it to speak about a theory in science. Theories are explanations. They aren't truths or anything like that. They're explanations of the natural world. And sometimes we'll refer to them as facts. And that's fine. We just got to keep our definition straight. Now that that's out of the way, let's move along here. So, as far as evidence goes, no claim in the history of ever has ever been evidence of anything. It's not based on observation, testing, or experimentation. Now see, if I make the claim, Devil's Tower looks like a tree stump, which we're going to touch on here in a couple of minutes, that is a claim. It's not even a hypothesis. Why isn't it a hypothesis? Because it's not based on any actual empirical evidence. It may look like a tree stump to you, but that's an interpretation from an observation you made by looking at a photo or a video. It's not evidence in a scientific sense. Now, I got to deal with these because these are something people really get confused on as what qualifies as evidence. Are photos and videos evidence? Empirical evidence? Yes, they are. Camera can be an observer, just like I can. It can record things directly. Granted, it can't open a book and take down notes, but it doesn't need a mind to record reality. So it can be empirical evidence. Now, to make this a little fun here, I'm going to reveal my dark sense of humor and present you with a video here of me pretending to be a guy talking about being abducted by aliens. So let's just watch that here for a second, and I want you to think about evidence and photos and video and how that and what type of evidence you're actually looking at when you watch this alien abduction video.
Hey guys, this must have been mid-1990s, so I was in my early 20s, something like that. I was drunk, passed out in the backyard from a night of partying at the fraternity. And as I lay on my back and look at the stars, all of a sudden one becomes really bright and gets closer and closer, and then within an instant, I'm no longer on the lawn. I am someplace, I assume aboard a ship of some sort, that this light had taken me. And on this ship or whatever it was were these tall, slender beings that did not look human. And I noticed I was cold because I was naked. They had me over a table, bent over, and they began to do experiments on me, some of which were not pleasant to experience. Like, you know, a lot of the stuff was just them taking skin samples and whatnot. But at one point they did come over with...
Now, as you can see, here I am playing a character talking about being abducted by aliens. Now, what is this video evidence of? It is evidence. I'm not going to deny that. The video fits the definition of empirical evidence. However, is it evidence of an alien abduction? No. It's a story I'm telling as a character. It's evidence that I recorded a video of a story about alien abduction, but it's not evidence of an alien abduction. People tell stories. It's human nature. It's what we do. Our stories can be based off truth and fact. There is no requirement that says they have to be even close to related off truth and or fact, all right? And just because somebody makes a video and tells you something doesn't mean they're providing you with any evidence or anything reflective of reality. Just because they're claiming something and they have a bunch of pictures doesn't mean the photos are evidence of what they're claiming, okay? Because hold on, I'm going to add a word here to this. All right, arguments. Now, in a lot of persuasive videos, whether it's politically persuasive in nature or somebody trying to convince you that Devil's Tower is a tree stump, they use arguments. It's important to understand that, you know, in philosophy, arguments are presented, but they aren't evidence of anything. An argument is a starting point in science, all right? It can help you formulate that initial question that can lead to a hypothesis. An argument, in and of itself, is not evidence of anything. It's a position you're taking. Could that be based on evidence? Sure. Could it be based out of a claim you pulled out of your hindquarters? Of course it can. And I often hear in arguments analogies. So let's talk about analogies. Here I have an envelope that says analogy. I was originally going to do an entire video just based off this word, but I decided not to do that. But I'll incorporate it here. Let's open it up and see what's on the paper. We have the definition of an analogy right here. An analogy is an imperfect and limited comparison between two things. It could be more than two, but two is usually the limit within understanding, typically for the purpose of clarification or to simplify a complex part of a concept or model. The things being compared need not be similar in nature. What does that mean? Well, another way to think of an analogy is like a metaphor, if you will, okay? Analogies are when you compare two things that are unrelated so someone can understand that, and they're limited in scope. An analogy is not meant to be extrapolated to the nth degree, nor is it meant to be converted into a claim that you're going to say is evidence of some argument you're trying to convince someone of. What's an example of an appropriate use of an analogy and an inappropriate use of an analogy? Say I want to explain to you how the Earth spins about its axis once every 24 hours, and you have no concept of that. You've never seen a globe or anything like that, but you know the Earth is spherical, okay? And you know a day is about 24 hours for all intensive purposes, all right? How could I explain to you the Earth spinning about its axis as simply as possible? Well, you know, I could sit there and try to technically explain it to you and the mechanisms involved and going all the way back to planet formation, but if you don't have a concept of that, I have to use an analogy. And I can use the analogy of a spinning top. Say you've seen one of those, or I have one I can show you. And that the Earth, like a top, spins about an axis, a line of rotation. So if I sit there and say the Earth spins about its axis once every 24 hours, like a top spins, just much slower, you can get a picture in your mind of how that would occur. This is an inappropriate analogy because it's going to be used to make an extrapolated claim masquerading as evidence, but it's really not. And many of you have probably heard this before, but I'm going to use it here anyway, or something like it. It has a lot of variations. I don't even know what it's called. But, okay. First of all, can I take parts of the human body or any organism and explain them through an analog using mechanical parts? Yes, I can. I could sit there and say, like, I need food the same way a car needs gasoline to run. I need food to keep my body going, just not as much as I do. All right? That's an appropriate analogy. It's just explaining something to you that you might not understand. It is not evidence of anything. It is not meant to be applied directly or as an equivalent to some biological function. That is not its purpose. It's so you can go, oh yeah, and have that eureka moment. All right? It's not evidence of anything, okay? So here's an appropriate analogy that often pops up in certain circles in one form or another. A pile of metal and parts will never assemble itself into a Jeep no matter how long you wait, therefore evolution is false. First of all, I guess that's kind of an analogy, but it takes some parts of biology and extrapolates the concept of you taking mechanical machines, applying them to some part of the body, and then extrapolating that to include all living things to make a claim about a scientific concept you don't even understand. All right? It's inappropriate. My analogy of gasoline in the car and me taking in food was not meant to be extrapolated to take the human body or any other living organism and completely compare it to a Jeep or any other mechanical device. That doesn't mean anything. Not to mention, Jeeps do not reproduce. They do not age and grow. And although my Jeep needs gas to run, if I don't put gas in it, it's not going to die because it can't die. It's not living. To sit there and imply that a Jeep is somehow analogous to an entire living organism is bull bunk. You don't even need to try to refute it. On its face, it's a faulty claim extrapolated from a bad analogy by someone trying to sell you a pile of rusty bolts. If you have evidence against a scientific theory, you have to follow the scientific method. You can jaw pound and jibber jab all you want about how you don't think it's reflective of reality, but you don't have any actual evidence against any scientific theory. Doesn't matter if it's just evolution. I'm just using that one because it's the most common one we are aware of, but flat earthers pull the exact same stuff that young earth creationists do, and the Devil's Tower is a tree trunk people do the same thing. I'm just randomly grabbing markers here out of my marker thing and keep going. I see if I get in the groove and I stop or pause too long, I lose my train of thought. I don't know if it's just me getting old or something wrong with my thinking process. I just have a hard time retaining it once I start doing something else. Multitasking has never been my thing. We could cross this out because I've already talked about it, even though you are going to see some more photos and video because I have been to Devil's Tower at least 3 times in my life, probably more. I think it's more, maybe 4. All right, and I've done the trail and I've looked at the rocks and I have the geologic background and knowledge to be able to interpret what I see from a scientific standpoint about what we know. But before I get into that, let's talk about this pareidolia. I actually have a hard time seeing things that aren't there. My pareidolia box doesn't work as well as it does with other people, apparently. But it doesn't mean you're just seeing stuff that isn't there. You know, it's not a hallucination, all right? For those of you that regularly watch my videos, you know this has popped up in a recent Geophiles in the Field episode. But anyway, if you just saw this laying somewhere on the ground and just looked at it and had no idea of its origin, just looked at its shape, you could conclude something that, well, you know, just looking at it before picking it up and getting that tactile contact to make observations, all right? I mean, if you really wanted to, you could sit there and say, somebody left a stack of pancakes on the ground that are starting to go moldy and decay, all right? But you pick it up then. You go, oh, this is heavy. It's pretty hard. It's not soft at all. Okay, maybe it's not pancakes. Pancakes is your pareidolia in action. It looks like something familiar to you, triggers something in your head, a memory or an association, and you sit there and extrapolate. You make a claim that this is something familiar to you and your experiences. Is that okay? Yeah, it is. But to actually claim this object is a stack of rotting pancakes is bull bunk. All right? It is not. So you pick it up, and you have it in your hands, and you notice it's heavy. Okay. And, you know, they're not coming apart. All right, it's a rock. I'm gonna assume this is a rock, which actually turns out to be the case. It is a rock. You're starting to make basic observations. Say you look around and you see more rocks like this in an outcrop. That's evidence, all right? This is a rock, all right? Now you know it's a rock. You may not know the history of it or the fact that it's a ball pillow structure or anything like that, but you don't need to come to a logical conclusion. But what did I have to do with that rock in order to get you to think logically and come to a correct conclusion based off evidence? You had to touch it, okay? You had to hold it in your hands. Now, I'm not saying that's necessary for evidence, but as human beings, when we hold something in our hands, something tactile, okay? It doesn't matter what it is. It can get our gears going that just looking at something cannot. So at least the rock interpretation is based off evidence. The pancake interpretation is based off pareidolia. So where's the line between pareidolia and knowing something isn't pareidolia? Like Mount Rushmore, for example. Take that. Those are 4 presidents carved into granitic rock. You know, I look into that mountain and I see 4 familiar faces. All right? Is that pareidolia? No, that is not pareidolia. Even though I'm not up there, and even though I'm looking at them from a distance, I recognize those 4 faces, okay? I can sit there and attach names to them, even if I don't remember them at the time. And then I can look up the history of Mount Rushmore and see if there's any actual historical evidence of it being carved, and there is. So the faces in Mount Rushmore are not pareidolia caused by our minds trying to interpret what we visually see. We have evidence to the contrary. If you don't have evidence to the contrary, all you have is a claim, no matter how articulate, well-spoken, or how much you agree with it. Right? It's just a claim. Okay, so now let's talk about Devil's Tower a bit. I've done several videos on Devil's Tower. They will all be linked below if you'd like to look at them. One, we even used the camera to zoom in on some hikers that were very, very far away that you couldn't even see with your naked eye very well. You could tell someone was there, but you needed to zoom and you can see the guy's face. So that's a cool one, and I really like that one. It also shows you that zooming in on an object using a camera, a digital one with complex lenses in it, doesn't make things round. Okay, that guy's face has not been rounded at all. I digress. Sorry, I got distracted by flat earth nonsense there for a second, but there's other stuff kind of ties into that. Well, I did an episode years ago on our present best fitting theory. Now, there's a lot of hypotheses as to how this thing formed, but they all scientifically involve melted rock. Now you might hear me say magma when I mean lava, and lava when I mean magma. So just remember, it's melted rock, all right? Because this thing formed apparently very close to the surface, all right? So lava, magma, potato as far as I'm concerned at that point. And many of you know I hate those terms anyway, but everyone is familiar with them, so I use them. In 2015, someone did a paper explaining that Devil's Tower may actually be a Mar diatreme. I'm not going to go into detail as to what that is. I did it in length in my last episode explaining Devil's Tower. Now, what happens on occasion is my videos typically only get about 100 to 200 views within the first year or two. Then the algorithms kick in, and now some will go up, some won't. There's videos I've released 4 or 5 years ago that still have like 100 views. But once the algorithm catches it, I start getting influxes of weirdos. And I'm just going to say it, people not grounded in reality. Now, I'm not sure that the most recent barrage, and it's against that video, is due to the algorithms or some new video or something somebody released claiming Devil's Tower is a tree, and they all found my video and came at me. Now, those of you that know my videos, if you have a quote legitimate question, or you propose something legitimate or something like that, ask me a real good question. I'm going to respond if I catch it. And I'm going to encourage that because it's necessary. So let's talk about Devil's Tower, which is what I quickly drew here. There is no scale. I will put basic stats on the screen as I talk if you want to know about them. But this is basically what it looks like as if you were away from it, coming up on the road to look at it. I will put some pictures here for you as well so you can see what it actually looks like. And like I said, we've walked all the way around this many times. I've walked around this with Sarah twice already. I do remember that much. But anyway, basically what you have is relatively level land, relatively. And all of a sudden this dark, kind of grayish, brownish rock just pops up out of the landscape. And most of this stuff is sedimentary and it's red, or it's kind of a yellow, light yellowish brown, or what some people call tan color. So it's a striking difference, not only in size and shape, but in color as well. So a couple years ago, I did a video about it from a scientific standpoint. Recently, within the past couple months or so, I've started getting stuff saying, it's a tree stump. Now, this has floated around several times over the years. 2017, which may even have been the year I originally did the video, could have been 2018, I forget. But I do remember a Facebook post, and I tracked it down, claiming that we found roots under here using seismology. Number one, that's complete bull bunk. That is an absolute, flat out, false claim. It is not true at all. It was pulled from someone's backside. Okay? This is that Facebook post. Now, as you can see, there's a link to the evidence. I clicked on that link today, and this is what I got. There's no active domain for that link. So, what can be asserted without evidence can be thrown out the window without evidence. Fast forward 4 years, and I start getting weird responses on that video again. Look at it below, read the comments down there if you'd like. It's linked below. Now, you look at this, and this is Pareidolia. I would never look at this and think, even if I didn't know geology, I wouldn't look at this and think tree stump. That wouldn't click with me. My Pareidolia isn't that active. Now, first, what you need to remember is when you come up to this, there is a trail around here that goes all the way around. A lot of you are familiar with this from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when he starts making this thing out of mashed potatoes. And then he eventually goes to visit it and climbs up the backside to get to the top where everybody and the aliens are. You cannot climb this by scooching up a backside. There is no forested slope or anything like that. This is like this on all sides. It's nearly vertical. You have to climb it with ropes and equipment. You cannot do it by just fumbling up a backside. And I've never been to the top. I ain't climbing this. I'm afraid to death of heights, and I would never climb something like this, but you can if you wanted to. It is legal, okay? But if you could get to the top, thanks to the magic of Google Earth, you would see what we call a hexagonal pattern. We see this in other places too, with this as the sides. We see this on Isle Royale in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which I still have to go to. And we see this at Giant's Causeway, also someplace I've never been. You see this on the top, and you see these long columns. We call that columnar jointing. Well, what's that mean? Well, joint is a fracture. It's essentially the same thing. And it's columnar because it forms long columns. And on this rubble pile on the bottom, you will see massive columns that have fallen. And each one of these is about, I mean, they do vary, they are not perfect, but it's about 10 feet in width this way. Length varies, but it's always greater than that. It's about 10 feet in width, which is about 3 meters. These things are huge. Now, if I go to the top of this and I see this hexagonal pattern, have you ever seen a tree with a hexagonal pattern that you've cut through, down and through? By the way, the fact that trees can't grow this tall and that you would have to have somebody very huge with a very big saw to cut this thing down, we're not going to tackle that aspect. It's just the claim that this is a tree stump is ridiculous on so many fronts, but we're just going to deal with the geology here. But anyway, you look at the top and you see this. Now, if it was the top of a tree, you would see a ring-like structure. Now, in my Jugurtha, and sorry if I mispronounced that, Tableland video, you look down at it, you do see what appears to be rings. I encourage you to watch that video because they aren't rings on that. But at least from above, it looks like rings. This doesn't look like rings from above at all. No tree forms this pattern, okay? So you got this columnar jointing with hexagonal tops. That's the top view of these here on top. But you come down and that jointing changes direction. It's no longer pretty much vertical. It begins to slope. And this is where the problem comes in our old models. One of the traditional hypotheses was that this was a volcanic neck, the neck of a volcano, and the volcano eroded. There's absolutely no evidence of a volcano. There's other structures made of the same stuff that's made of this nearby that don't look anything like this. And if it's made of the same stuff that formed around the same time, it's logical to assume that something similar formed all of these, if not the same thing or the same event. The biggest bit of evidence that this is not a volcanic neck is a columnar jointing itself. We look at most columnar joints and they form perpendicular to lava flow. Okay, now we've all been shown what a model of a volcano from the time we were kids. And this is just a generic cross-section of a volcano. Now, it doesn't matter what type it is or anything like that. It could even be a standard cinder cone. You get melt, lava, magma, whatever. Magma as it's coming up, lava once it's out. Coming up through the surface and then falling over or exploding over or whatever. Now, if this was a volcanic neck, and it kind of looks like that, I can see where that comes from. And that wouldn't be Pareidolia. That would be looking at the rock, and I'm going to get into the rock type here, just bear with me. Now, looking at the rock and studying the rock, making measurements, observations, stuff like that, this is a testable claim. If a claim is testable, it can become a hypothesis. But in and of itself, a claim doesn't mean anything, all right? If you can't show it, you don't know it, all right? So lava comes up, magma, whatever. So over time, this hardens. But as this hardens, columnar jointing, we know this from actually observing this in places like Hawaii and stuff like that, that lava, when it flows on the surface, columnar joints tend to form perpendicular to the flow. They don't form parallel. This would be parallel. Now it does change direction, the columnar jointing, and that's kind of funny, but we do know that columnar jointing from lava underwater, because these form from rapid cooling. So the rock tends to be fine-grained. Now you can get columnar jointing in many different types of rock. The most common are aphanitic or fine-grained rocks, usually basalts. This isn't a basalt. And I'll get into that when I get into the rock. But you can also get columnar jointing from contact heat from volcanism in sedimentary rocks. You can actually get those to form columnar joints. And there's examples of that in many places throughout the world. But that's rare. This is common, columnar jointing in fine-grained igneous rock. So if this was deposited, say, into a lake or something like that, you would get more jumbled columnar jointing. But this is not jumbled. So basically, in a nutshell, the Mar diatreme model does account for this. Basically, this was really close to the surface when it cooled quickly and was more extensive laterally. This is just the center that remains. This is where it came up through. If we were to drill down or do real seismology, we would be able to define this, but as far as I know, that has not been done. All right, so you hear me talking about this being an igneous rock. How do we know this is an igneous rock? All right, and there are people on that comment thread that have sat there and said this is an actual tree stump, like made of wood. All you have to do to know that's BS is go there, walk up to it, and look at it. You can tell it's rock. Now, it's not legal to take rock from there, and there are a lot of other same rock that form this in the area. But you go up to it, and you look at it, and you can tell it's not wood, all right? Well, then the other claim is it's a fossilized tree stump. Well, you can't fossilize into igneous rock. That doesn't happen. And you would have primary structures preserved, especially in something as original looking as a tree stump as this appears to some people. You would see tree rings up here, all right? You would see bark and other things characteristic of trees. This has none of that, and not even from a distance, really. Just other than the basic, it looks like a tree stump, there's no evidence that this is a tree stump. Now, since this is made of igneous rock, it cannot possibly be a tree stump. Tree stumps do not solidify from melted rock, okay? They do not form from magma or lava in anyone's world. Okay, so you go up to it and you start looking at the rock, and it is igneous. It's something called a phonolite. Basically, for intensive purposes, all you need to know is it's not basalt. It's a igneous rock devoid of quartz. Basalts have some quartz in them. Phonolites don't have any. They have something called foids in them. Foids and quartz cannot form together. I've talked about this before, so we're just going to stop that there. But basically, it is an aphanitic, fine-grained igneous rock that cooled really fast. But it does have something in it called phenocrysts. And phenocrysts are larger crystals in a dominantly fine-grained rock. Now, they differ from xenocrysts in one little aspect, and sometimes the words are used interchangeably. I don't have a problem with it as long as it's explained. Xenocrysts are foreign clasts brought up from the country rock, or the rock that this thing would have encountered as it intruded. So if I saw a chunk of sandstone in this, that would be, well, it'd be metamorphosed of quartzite, but that would be a xenocryst. If I see crystals in it made of the same stuff that this essentially is, but coarse grain that I can see with my naked eye, it cooled from the magma that produced the rest of it, so that's a phenocryst. That's essentially the only difference. So xenocryst is something included that's not from the melt. The phenocryst is something odd that did form from the melt. But it is igneous. And how do we know phonolites are igneous? Until we could do experiments, it was actually just an assumption based on the characteristic of the rock and other related rocks. And then we started melting rocks and seeing what would crystallize. And I've talked about this before, Bones reaction series. When you melt rocks, all right, and see what crystallizes out, you are essentially creating a melt, a magma for that rock to form. And as those crystals form, you get different types of rocks depending on your temperature, pressure, water content, and all those other things. So we know phonolites are formed from magma bodies, as are basalts and granites and trachytes and rhyolites and void-rich rocks, you know, all of that stuff. Which means it ain't no tree stump. It can't be. Just because something looks like something at first glance doesn't mean it is that thing. As humans, we do that quite often, the pareidolia thing I've been talking about. And that has some sort of evolutionary advantage, I'm sure, but I'm not a biologist, so I'm not sure what that would be. But if you know, feel free to let me know in the comments. So if you have a scientific question that you think can be answered in a 30 to 45 minute time frame, maybe up to an hour, feel free to leave it below, because the geofiles are more technical and drawn out. But make sure it can at least be 30 minutes long. If it's something I can answer in 5 minutes, I may just answer it right there in the comments. But anyway, I think that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave below, and I hope you learned something.